The server room at Caldwell and Pierce Legal had not made a sound in 41 hours. That was the problem. Servers were supposed to hum. They were supposed to breathe. The low, steady drone of cooling fans and hard drives spinning at 10,000 RPM, the quiet mechanical heartbeat of a firm that billed $400 an hour and had 3 active cases worth a combined $62 million sitting inside those drives. When Derek Caldwell walked past the glass door of the IT suite on a Tuesday morning and heard nothing, he stopped. He put his hand flat against the glass. He felt no vibration. He called the IT director from the hallway. Then he called him again. By 9:15 that morning, the entire 4th floor of the Caldwell and Pierce building in downtown Ottawa knew that the primary server array had gone dark sometime overnight. The backup failover had not triggered. The cloud redundancy, which the firm had been paying a monthly subscription for since 2019, had not caught a single file because the sync had been suspended 3 weeks earlier for a firmware update that nobody had re-enabled afterward. 3 weeks. Someone had forgotten to flip a switch 3 weeks ago, and now 41 hours before the most important court filing Derek Caldwell had managed in his 20-year career. Every document, every deposition transcript, every annotated exhibit, every billing record, every piece of digital evidence for the Hartman environmental class action was sitting inside a machine that refused to make a sound. Derek Caldwell stood in the middle of his office on the 22nd floor and stared at the Ottawa River without seeing it. He was 54 years old, and he had spent those 54 years believing that preparation was the only thing standing between a man and disaster. He had backup plans for his backup plans. He had protocols. He had a laminated emergency contact sheet taped inside the supply closet door that his assistant Joanna had updated every January since 2011. None of it had mattered. "Get me the best data recovery firm in the country," he told Joanna. Not the second best, the best. The firm was called Meridian Data Solutions. They operated out of a glass tower in Toronto, and their website listed 17 enterprise clients, 4 government contracts, and a success rate they described as industry-leading. Their emergency response team arrived in Ottawa by chartered flight at 2 in the afternoon. 4 technicians in black polo shirts carrying equipment cases the size of small refrigerators. Their lead specialist, a man named Trevor Wicks, shook Derek's hand in the lobby and spoke with the calm authority of someone who had never in his life failed to recover a server. "We've seen worse," Trevor said. He said it the way a surgeon says it in a waiting room, not to comfort, to establish. The Meridian team set up in the server room and got to work. Derek Caldwell went back to his office and told his associates to begin reconstructing whatever they could from email threads, printed drafts, and memory. His junior counsel, a 28-year-old named Evan Strickland who had been awake since 3 in the morning running diagnostics on his own laptop, stood in the doorway with a yellow legal pad and said quietly, "I think I know what happened." Derek looked at him. "The RAID controller," Evan said. "When they swapped the drives last month for the capacity upgrade, I think they put them back in the wrong slot order. The controller wouldn't recognize the array correctly. It would look like a hardware failure, but it might not be. The data could still be there." Derek studied Evan for a moment. Evan was young. His tie was crooked and there was a coffee stain on his left cuff, and he had the particular hollow expression of someone who had been staring at a screen since before sunrise. "Let the professionals handle it," Derek said. "That's what we're paying them for." Evan nodded. He wrote something on his yellow legal pad and walked back to his desk. By midnight on the first day, Trevor Wicks reported that the situation was complex but manageable. He ordered specialized equipment from a partner lab in Montreal. He spoke about firmware architecture and platters and sector mapping in the tone of a man reciting scripture, and Derek Caldwell listened and nodded and felt, for the first time in his life, completely outside his own understanding. The second day passed. The specialized equipment arrived. Trevor's team worked in 4-hour rotations. The invoice from Meridian sat in Derek's email, growing incrementally every 6 hours, a living document denominated in 5 figures. On the morning of the third day, with 19 hours left before the filing deadline, Trevor Wicks came upstairs and sat across from Derek Caldwell in the glass-walled boardroom and set his hands flat on the table. "We've isolated the issue," Trevor said, "but the recovery window is going to be tight. We're talking another 18 to 24 hours minimum." Derek was quiet for a long moment. "The filing is in 19 hours. I understand that. If we miss this filing, the class action gets dismissed. 214 families lose everything they came here for." Trevor Wicks looked at him steadily. "Mr. Caldwell, we are doing everything in our power." Derek thanked him, and Trevor left, and Derek sat in the boardroom alone and looked at the ceiling. He had spent $178,000 in 3 days, and the best data recovery team in the country was telling him to wait. At 7:15 that evening, the cleaning crew arrived on the 4th floor. They came the way they always came, quietly, with the particular invisibility of people who do their best work when no one is watching. The crew chief that night was a man named Novak. He was 51 years old, broad through the shoulders, with calloused hands and a face that had been weathered by something other than just weather. He pushed his supply cart off the service elevator and began making his way through the cubicles, emptying waste bins, wiping down surfaces, moving through the space with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this particular route 400 times and could do it in the dark. He was not supposed to go near the server room. It had a keycard lock and a sign on the door that said Offwor's personnel only, and for the 2 years that Novak had been working this contract for Sterling Building Services, he had always walked past it without slowing down. But that night the door was propped open with a doorstop. Someone from the Meridian team had left it that way when they'd gone upstairs for coffee, and as Al pushed his cart past the opening, he glanced inside. He stopped, not because he was curious. He stopped because he recognized something. The way you recognize a word in a foreign language you studied once a long time ago and thought you'd forgotten. Inside the server room, the Meridian equipment was spread across 3 folding tables. Server racks stood open. The drives had been partially removed and labeled with colored stickers, yellow, red, blue. In what he could tell, even from the doorway, was the wrong sequence. Novak stood at the threshold for 11 seconds. Then he pushed his cart a few feet past the door, parked it against the wall, and walked back to look again. He was not a data recovery specialist. He had not been one for a very long time. But from 1998 to 2014, he had been a senior systems engineer at a telecommunications company in Calgary. 16 years of his life spent inside server rooms not unlike this one, troubleshooting arrays, diagnosing hardware failures, writing technical documentation that people with advanced degrees had relied on without ever knowing his name. Then came the accident on the Deerfoot, 3 surgeries, 8 months of recovery, a Soprano package that lasted 14 months, a marriage that lasted 16, a daughter named Britt who was now 12 years old and who Derek had never met and would never meet, but who was the reason Novak showed up to this building at 7:15 every evening and cleaned floors until 2 in the morning without complaint. He looked at the drive sequence. He looked at the controller card. He looked at the firmware version sticker on the enclosure panel, a small white label printed in 6-point font that most people would have needed a magnifying glass to read. He thought, that's a 2018 controller running 2021 drives. They would have needed a firmware bridge to make the array visible. Without it, the controller would misread the slot mapping entirely. The system would report a catastrophic failure when the data was sitting there perfectly intact, waiting to be addressed correctly. He thought about it for a moment longer. Then he turned around and went back to emptying waste bins. He had finished the 4th floor washrooms and was starting on the kitchen alcove when he heard the voices coming down the hallway. 2 men, urgent, low. One of them he recognized as the young lawyer who had been in the server room that morning before sunrise, still wearing yesterday's shirt, still carrying his yellow legal pad. The other man was someone Al had not seen before. Older, the kind of posture that came from decades of being listened to. We have 17 hours, the older man was saying. 17 hours and I need an answer that isn't we're working on it. The young lawyer Evan said quietly, I told you what I thought it was, Evan. I know. The professionals are handling it. They were passing the kitchen alcove. Al was wringing out a mop. Neither man looked at him. Evan Strickland glanced back, almost without meaning to, the way people sometimes glance at things they're not sure they saw. He stopped walking. Derek Caldwell stopped too. Evan said to Al, sorry, did you hear what we were saying just now? Al looked up. Some of it, the server room. You walked past it earlier, did you look inside? It was a strange question for a lawyer to ask a custodian. Al recognized the strangeness of it, and he recognized what it cost the young man to ask it. The slight tightening around his eyes, the way he held the legal pad at his side like he was trying to look less desperate than he was. I glanced in, Al said. Do you know anything about servers? The older man made a sound, small, involuntary, the kind of sound that comes out when someone's patience is wearing through. Al looked at Derek Caldwell. Then he looked at Evan Strickland. He made a decision. A little, he said. Derek Caldwell would later describe the next 4 minutes as the most uncomfortable 4 minutes of his professional life. And he had once argued a case in front of a Supreme Court justice with a broken rib. Novak walked into the server room with his arms at his sides and spent 40 seconds looking at the equipment without touching anything. Trevor Wicks was not present, he was upstairs. One of the junior Meridian technicians, a young woman named Shay, was monitoring a diagnostic scan from a folding chair. She looked up when Al walked in. She looked at the mop handle he was still holding. She started to say something. What firmware version did you flash to the controller when you swapped the drives? Al asked her. Shay blinked. I'm sorry, the controller card. The 2018 enclosure. When you put the new drives in last month, whoever did the installation, did they update the controller firmware before they rebuilt the array or after? Shay stared at him. I don't know. I wasn't here for the installation. That was a different team, okay, Al said. He looked at the enclosure panel. He looked at the sticker. He looked at the slot sequence, yellow, red, blue, yellow, red, blue. The drives are out of order, he said. Lots 2 and 4 are transposed. The controller is reading a 6-drive array as 2 separate 3-drive arrays, and the firmware version you're running doesn't have the patch that allows cross-slot mapping on these specific drives. That's why your diagnostics aren't finding any data. It's not that the data isn't there. It's that the controller doesn't know how to look for it correctly. The room was very quiet. Evan Strickland was standing in the doorway writing on his yellow legal pad. Derek Caldwell was standing behind Evan and looking at a man in a cleaning uniform who was speaking about his servers the way a cardiologist speaks about a patient's chart. Not with performance, not with drama, but with the flat certainty of someone who simply knows what they're looking at. The fix, Al said, is to pull drives 2 and 4, swap them back to the correct positions, then boot the controller in degraded mode with the legacy mapping flag enabled. The system should recognize the array immediately. After that, you run a parity check, probably takes about 90 minutes, and your data is intact. Shay said very carefully, that's not a standard recovery approach. No, Al agreed. But it's the right one for this specific controller with these specific drives in this specific configuration. Standard approaches are built around common failures. This isn't a common failure, this is a sequencing error that presents like a common failure. Another silence. Who are you? Shay asked. Al looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the mop in his hand, and at the Meridian equipment cases stacked against the wall, and at the invoice printout someone had left on the folding table. He couldn't read the total from where he was standing, but he could see enough digits to understand the general shape of the number. I'm with the cleaning crew, he said. 4th floor, I should finish the kitchen. He turned and walked out. In the hallway, Derek Caldwell caught up with him in 4 steps. Wait, he said. Al stopped. He turned around. Derek Caldwell was a man who had spent 30 years learning how to read people across a boardroom table. Their confidence, their hesitation, their knowledge, their gaps. He stood in the fluorescent light of the 4th floor corridor and looked at Al Novak the way he looked at witnesses on the stand, not to intimidate but to understand. What's your background? He asked. Systems engineering, Al said. Calgary. Long time ago. How long? Left the field in 2014. Derek calculated. 12 years. Yes, and you're certain about what you just described in there. Al took a breath. He was quiet for a moment, not because he was uncertain, but because he was deciding how much of the truth to hand to a stranger in a hallway. He thought about Britt, about the school fees for September, about the oil change his truck needed and the way the back brake was starting to pulse when he pressed the pedal and how he hadn't had time to deal with it. I'm certain, he said. Derek nodded once. Then he said, I need you to stay. Trevor Wicks came downstairs at 9 o'clock that evening and was briefed by Shay. He listened. His expression did not change, the way expressions don't change when someone is working very hard to maintain them. He walked into the server room and looked at the drive sequence. He looked at the controller card. He picked up a flashlight and read the sticker on the enclosure panel, moving his lips slightly. Then he set the flashlight down. He did not speak for a long time. The cross-slot mapping issue, he said finally. With the 2018 controller on the newer drives. Yes, Shay said. We should have caught that. Yes, this was the particular stillness of a man recalculating. Not the situation, but himself, his invoice, his 17 enterprise clients, his industry-leading success rate. Get me drives 2 and 4, he said quietly. The parity check ran for 83 minutes. At 11:47 that evening, the array came online. Every file, every deposition, every exhibit, every annotated brief, every billing record for the Hartman environmental class action appeared in the directory exactly where it had always been, intact, undamaged, sitting patiently in the dark for 65 hours waiting for someone to ask the right question. Evan Strickland was the one who found Al Novak. He was in the service corridor near the freight elevator loading his cart for the ride downstairs. It worked, Evan said. Al nodded. Good, how did you know? I mean, you looked in that room for 40 seconds. Al lifted a bag of garbage into the cart. I worked with that controller model for about 6 years. I've seen the sequencing error before. It's rare enough that people don't think to look for it. Common enough that I recognized it the moment I saw the slot labels. Evan looked at him for a moment. You told my boss it was the RAID controller this morning, before Meridian even started. I didn't tell your boss anything. Right, I did, and he told me to let the professionals handle it. Evan paused. I should have pushed harder. You were right about the controller, Al said. That's the part that mattered. But I wasn't right about the specific cause. You were. How did you even, from a glance through the door, because I've cleaned this floor twice a week for 2 years, Al said. And I walked past that server room every single time. I knew what it was supposed to look like. When it looked wrong, I saw it. Evan was quiet. There's a version of knowing things, Al continued, still loading the cart, still moving with the same unhurried efficiency he brought to every task. That comes from studying something in a classroom and getting tested on it and putting it on a resume. And then there's the version that comes from sitting with something for 16 years and making every mistake it's possible to make and learning from every single one. Those two versions look different from the outside. The second one doesn't always come with a certificate. He pushed the cart toward the elevator. Press the button. Tell your boss the filing will go through, he said. Get some sleep. Derek Caldwell filed the Hartman motion at 7:48 the following morning, 14 minutes ahead of the deadline. 214 families in Sudbury in Sault Ste. Marie and 3 communities along the north shore of Lake Huron that had spent 11 years watching a mining operation poison their water, moved one step closer to an answer. Derek did not go home after the filing. He sat at his desk as the sun came up over the Ottawa River and his city came awake around him, and he thought about a man in a cleaning uniform who had walked into a room, looked at equipment for 40 seconds, and seen something that 4 professional technicians with specialized tools and 3 days and $178,000 had missed. He thought about Evan Strickland standing in his doorway yesterday morning with a coffee stain on his cuff, saying quietly, "I think I know what happened." He thought about the sound he himself had made, that small involuntary sound, and what it meant that he had made it. He found Al Novak's supervisor at Sterling Building Services. He made a call. He didn't ask for Al's contact information directly. He asked instead whether the company had a formal process for recognizing contract staff who went above and beyond. The supervisor said there was a commendation form. Derek said that wasn't what he meant. He thought for a moment and then said what he actually meant, which was that he wanted Al Novak to know that the work he did that night had made it possible for 214 people to have their day in court. That it mattered. That he, Derek Caldwell, who had never once in 30 years forgotten to re-enable a cloud backup sync, was not too proud to say so to the man who had cleaned his floors on a Tuesday evening and seen what no one else had thought to look for. The supervisor was quiet for a moment. Then he said he would pass it along. Al Novak heard about it on a Thursday. He was in the parking lot outside his building in Gloucester, loading groceries into his truck. His phone rang. It was his shift supervisor at Sterling who told him that the senior partner at Caldwell and Pierce had called the company directly and requested that the commendation be noted in Al's file and reflected in his next performance review. Al stood by the open tailgate with a bag of groceries in each hand. He also said, his supervisor added a little awkwardly, that you should know the filing went through. Something about families in a court case. He said you'd understand. Al set the bags down in the truck bed. He stood there for a moment in the October air, the kind of cold that comes off the Ottawa River and makes you feel like the season means something. He thought about the server room, about the slot sequence and the controller firmware and the particular shape of a problem that presents as one thing and is actually another. He thought about 16 years of work that had disappeared from his resume as cleanly as files from a corrupted drive, and the way expertise persists regardless, the way it sits there in the dark, intact, waiting for the right question. He thought about Britt, who would be home from school in an hour. He closed the tailgate, he got in the truck, he drove home. He did not tell anyone what had happened. Not because it didn't matter to him, it did, in the particular way that things matter when they arrive quietly and without ceremony, but because explaining it would have required him to describe a version of himself that existed a long time ago, and the distance between that version and this one felt, most days, like something he carried privately. The truck's rear brake still pulsed when he pressed the pedal. He noticed it at the first red light and made a note to deal with it this weekend. Some things you fix the moment you recognize them. Some things you put off because the list is long and the days are short, and you are one person trying to hold multiple things together at the same time. He knew the difference between those two categories. He had learned it the hard way in a server room in Calgary, in a hospital bed in Calgary, in a courtroom in Calgary, in a dozen unremarkable Tuesday evenings on a 4th floor in Ottawa where the right answer was already present, waiting, in the hands of someone no one had thought to ask.